This dog refused to leave a grave. The reason is heartbreaking. It started with a solitary figure in the distance, illuminated by the final slivers of twilight. At first glance, it seemed like a forgotten shadow, a small shape hunched over freshly turned earth. Nothing about it moved for several long seconds. A cold wind swept across the cemetery, rustling the crisp leaves of the nearby willow. The figure stayed still, rigid, almost like a statue in the fading light. Instinctively felt a pull to look closer. It was as if something in the air compelled them to stop and pay attention. That was the moment everything began. A single dog refusing to leave a grave. There was a raw tension in the scene. The dog's ears twitched at every sound as though it was fearful someone might chase it away. Or, worse, disrupt whatever silent vigil it was keeping. In the uncertain half-darkness, no one could tell if the animal was lying on the ground out of exhaustion or heartbreak. Whenever a curious passerby ventured too close, the dog let out a soft whine, a desperate plea that seemed half warning, half begging them not to disturb its spot. There was something heartbreakingly human in those sounds, enough to stop people in their tracks, enough to make them wonder. Why did this dog refuse to leave that grave? For weeks, the dog, later known by locals as Scrap, became a fixture at that solitary patch of earth. The townspeople didn't know its name or where it had come from, but they saw him every morning when the sun rose above the cemetery's ancient gates. Without fail, he was there. Some who lived nearby swore they heard howls late at night, echoing across the silent headstones. Others thought they caught glimpses of Scrap limping from one corner of the graveyard to another, as if searching for something, always returning to that same gravestone. Word of the dog spread. It wasn't long before the entire community was discussing it at grocery stores, in barbershops, outside church on Sunday. News traveled quickly. There was a dog, heartbreakingly loyal to a particular grave, no matter the weather, no matter the time of day. How this dog had become so fixated on that place was anyone's guess. Some speculated that the grave belonged to Scrap's owner. Others wondered if there was a missing child involved, a tragic story the newspapers had glossed over, or perhaps an elderly widower whose final companion had been his faithful pet. But no one knew for sure. There was no name on the tombstone, no marker except for the small, unpolished headstone that glimmered faintly in the dawn light. The caretaker of the cemetery, a stooped man named, claimed the plot was a recent burial. Unclaimed remains, he'd whispered in hushed tones, though he'd not elaborated on whose remains they were. Some said he had to bury people who died alone in hospitals. Others said it was a pauper's grave, paid for by the county. Whatever the truth, the caretaker eyed the dog with pity and confusion. Even he could not recall seeing the animal before, much less feeding it. On a cold Monday morning, approached Scrap. Slowly, carefully, he extended a trembling hand holding bits of leftover meat, hoping to coax the dog away from the mound. For a moment, Scrap raised his head and stared at with eyes so forlorn they could have told a lifetime of sorrow in a single glance. Then, softly, the dog rose to a standing position, circled around, and lay back down with a resolute sigh. That was the first time realized just how unwavering Scrap's resolve was. He tried again the next day, and the day after that, hoping that the warm scent of food might dislodge the dog from its vigil. But Scrap never budged. Locals pitched in with their own attempts. A kind-hearted woman named left a warm blanket near the grave, worried that the approaching winter cold would be too much for Scrap. She thought she saw him shuffle onto it at night, though each morning the blanket would be crumpled or pushed aside, as though the dog was restless in its sleep. Another visitor, a soft-spoken teenage boy named Leo, would read prayers aloud to the rows of headstones and sometimes leave a bowl of water for Scrap. A mother pushing a stroller past the cemetery gates noticed Scrap trembling in the rain one afternoon. She rushed home, grabbed an umbrella and crept quietly back, placing the umbrella as best as she could over the dog. Within hours, the wind had blown it away, but it was the thought that counted. Everyone tried to help in small ways. No one wanted to intrude too aggressively, because something about that dog's quiet heartbreak felt sacred. Amid the speculation, a series of small miracles began to occur. For one, every time it seemed Scrap might be on the verge of starvation, scraps of food would appear, sometimes left by a visitor, sometimes dropped off by a curious child, sometimes found as if by accident near the cemetery's entrance. Even when it looked like the dog hadn't eaten in days, it never truly withered. Its fur became matted and patches grew thin, yet those sorrowful eyes held a fierce determination, a love that burned beyond despair. And although the dog's body trembled with cold, it remained steadfast, day after day, in that exact spot. Rumors spread that the dog was a ghost. Others suggested it might be a divine sign, a test of compassion. Some even whispered that if you dared to watch the dog long enough, you'd see a second shape, a spectral presence, hovering near the grave, as though the dog was in silent communion with its lost loved one. These stories only fueled the public's fascination, turning the cemetery into an unlikely attraction. Small groups would gather at times, watching from a respectful distance. Occasionally, someone would snap a photo and share it on social media, with captions like "heartbreaking," "this dog refuses to leave a grave," or "loyalty beyond the grave." Each picture circulated widely, drawing more onlookers, even a few reporters. But as the weeks turned to months, the novelty wore off for many. The crowds thinned. People resumed their normal routines, dropping the dog from casual conversation. Yet still, day in and day out, Scrap remained. Through rainstorms and scorching afternoons, in the gloom of dusk and the gentle glow of dawn, the dog never left. A handful of the more sympathetic townsfolk worried that something terrible would happen to it. Perhaps it would freeze to death in the brutal upcoming winter. But each time they tried to coax it away, the dog resisted, as though an invisible tether bound it to that lonely patch of land. One morning, when the first frost glittered across the cemetery, decided she had to act. She arrived at dawn with her husband, a soft-spoken carpenter named, bringing a makeshift wooden shelter lined with old wool blankets. After quietly setting it up a few yards from the grave, they left a trail of treats leading inside. They hoped that maybe, just maybe, Scrap would see a warm refuge and choose comfort over heartbreak. Yet for hours the dog did not move. It remained at the graveside, nose resting on the cold dirt, as if waiting for someone to return. Undeterred, visited throughout the day, placing more food near the shelter's entrance, urging the dog to step away just long enough to curl up inside. Finally, late in the afternoon, Scrap stood up. With tentative steps, he sniffed at the line of treats leading into the shelter. His heart soared as the dog took one step inside, then another. For a moment it looked as though relief might finally come. Then an inexplicable thing happened. A gust of wind blew across the cemetery, swirling brittle leaves around the grave. The dog froze, nose twitching. Slowly it turned its head and gazed over its shoulder, as if hearing a silent call. Without hesitation, the dog backed out of the shelter and padded back to the graveside, curling once again into that familiar, sorrowful position. Watching from behind a nearby headstone, felt tears sting her eyes. It was as though the dog simply could not bear to be separated from that hallowed patch of earth. Disappointed but unwilling to give up, quietly gathered her supplies and left the small shelter in place, silently praying that the dog might find warmth eventually. Days passed, and the weather grew harsher. The caretaker discovered strange footprints in the cemetery one morning, muddy human footprints near the dog's makeshift shelter, leading away toward the back gate. They were accompanied by the distinct paw prints of a dog. Alarmed that someone might be trying to lure Scrap out at odd hours, decided to lock the gates overnight. That very night, a forlorn howling shattered the cemetery's calm. Neighbors claimed it sounded like a heartbreak-given voice, echoing for miles. When investigated the next morning, He found the dog exactly where it always was, but something was off. The fresh, unmarked headstone bore faint scratches in the stone, like a desperate message from beyond the grave. Terrified and intrigued, found himself on edge. He began performing his rounds more carefully, paying special attention to the dog's behavior. That was when he saw, for the first time, the dog lying with its front paws almost protectively around the base of the headstone. In the hours before dawn, the caretaker glimpsed Scrap trembling, muzzle pressed to the ground, as if the dog was trying to sink deeper into the dirt. It wasn't just heartbreak or loyalty anymore. It was longing, fierce and unimaginable. Driven by curiosity, and maybe a flicker of fear, delved into the cemetery records. If he could determine whose remains lay in that plot, perhaps he could solve the mystery. Late into the evening, by the light of a flickering table lamp, he pored over dog-eared ledgers dating back decades. He scoured digital databases on an outdated computer system, searching for anything that matched. But the grave had been recently dug, with minimal documentation. Unidentified male, approximate age 35 to 45, interred by county order. No next of kin listed, no mention of a dog, just a sealed casket in a lonely corner of the grounds. The caretaker rubbed his temples in frustration. The records were incomplete, overshadowed by bureaucratic red tape. He slammed the ledger shut with a deflated sigh, a heavy sense of foreboding settling in his stomach. Something was missing. Later that week, a young journalist named Mari, who'd seen a viral post about Scrap on social media, arrived at the cemetery with camera equipment in tow. She was determined to get the full story and share it with her news outlet. With a thick coat and trembling fingers, she approached the dog's resting place, half expecting to be greeted with snarls or growls. But Scrap merely flicked an ear in her direction, as though acknowledging her presence without any real interest. Mari crouched low, letting the camera roll, capturing the unassuming canine in its quiet vigil. She planned to live-stream the footage later that evening, hoping the heartfelt sight would resonate with viewers. It didn't take long for the live stream to explode in popularity. Thousands tuned in, enamored by the sight of Scrap's unwavering devotion. The chat filled with comments. "Dogs are too pure for this world. This breaks my heart. Someone adopt him. He's waiting for his owner." And in that rapid-fire stream of online chatter, a single comment appeared, fleeting yet impossible to ignore. "I know that dog. He belonged to my neighbor who disappeared 3 months ago." The message vanished almost as soon as it appeared, leaving Mari scrambling to screenshot the username. Her heart hammered with excitement and dread. Was it possible that the unclaimed grave was the final resting place of that missing neighbor? She tried to trace the commenter but came up empty. No response. No account to be found. It was as if it had never existed, except for the lingering screenshot on her phone. Embarking on a more thorough investigation, Mari knocked on doors in the surrounding neighborhoods, describing Scrap to anyone who would listen. She found an elderly woman who admitted to seeing a similar dog running through the streets a few months back, but she couldn't recall details. Another man said he'd heard rumors of a recluse who had a German Shepherd mix, though Scrap was smaller and scruffier, more like a terrier or possibly a mutt. Mari gleaned no conclusive leads, just a series of half-remembered stories that wove together like incomplete puzzle pieces. Yet the dog's unwavering presence at that grave suggested a bond beyond mere chance. The journalist's instincts told her there was more to discover. As winter set in fully, temperatures plummeted below freezing. A heavy snow blanketed the cemetery, transforming every headstone into a dome of white. In the midst of that frigid expanse, Scrap became almost invisible, a small mound of fur in a sea of frozen drifts. Concerned locals pleaded with the caretaker to let them take the dog home, but each time they tried, Scrap stubbornly resisted, twisting and turning out of their arms. Allowed them to leave food and water inside the gates, but deep down he feared the dog would not survive. He found himself waking in the middle of the night, plagued by images of the dog freezing to death on that lonely grave. One night, after a particularly vivid nightmare, he bundled up in his thick coat, grabbed a flashlight, and trudged out into the cemetery at 2 in the morning, determined to check on Scrap. Under the moonlight, the snow glowed with an otherworldly sheen. Each step crunched loudly under his boots, echoing in the stillness. As he approached the grave, he stopped short. There, illuminated by the moon, was Scrap, standing upright, face tilted toward the sky, a single paw placed gently on the headstone. The dog's posture seemed almost reverent. His breath caught in his throat. It was as if the dog was communing with something beyond the veil, howling in silent prayer. A strange feeling of unease and awe washed over him. Then, with a single tilt of its head, Scrap let out the most mournful, otherworldly howl he had ever heard. It was raw, pure grief, echoing through the rows of silent graves. Felt tears prick his eyes, unbidden, as though he had stumbled upon something sacred and heartbreaking. The following day, exhausted by the night's revelations, confided in Mari, telling her what he'd seen. Mari listened, her face pale. She admitted that she, too, had felt an inexplicable presence around the grave, as if the air itself grew heavier the closer you came. There was something about that place that transcended the normal heartbreak of a dog's devotion. It was bigger, older, more potent. She suggested that maybe Scrap was guarding something, some final memory or secret. That single notion haunted them both. What if the grave was not just an unknown man's resting place, but contained a story so deeply entwined with the dog that it refused to leave? Shortly after their conversation, Mari dug deeper into local police reports. She discovered a detail that set her heart racing. About 3 months prior, a John Doe had been found unconscious near an abandoned warehouse by the river. He died a few days later in the hospital. No identification. No one claimed the body. Preliminary attempts by the authorities to track down next of kin failed. The man was eventually buried at the county's expense. The timing matched. Could John Doe have been Scrap's owner? Determined to find proof, Mari called in a favor with a hospital administrator she knew. Slipping through confidential files was no easy task, but after hours of fruitless searching, she found a single note scrawled in a nurse's log. Patient admitted with extensive bruising and severe hypothermia. Brought in by a dog. Witness states a stray dog was barking for help. The rest was unreadable, smudged with water damage. But it was enough to make Mari gasp aloud. A stray dog barking for help, it had to be Scrap. This was more than mere loyalty, it was heroism. Yet in the end the man had died alone, with no identity, no recognized family. Possibly, the final face he saw was the muzzle of the dog he loved. The heartbreak twisted in Mari's stomach. No wonder Scrap would not leave. On some level, maybe the dog was still trying to summon help, still believing that his beloved friend could be saved. Armed with this new revelation, Mari shared everything with, and they decided to approach the local authorities to see if any identifying details could be gleaned from the man's personal effects. But the authorities had nothing. No wallet, no phone, no personal documents. The man was a ghost who vanished as soon as he appeared. Undeterred, Mari appealed to the local community for more information, organizing a small vigil at the cemetery for the unnamed man and his dog. She hoped that maybe, in gathering a crowd, someone might recognize Scrap or recall seeing the man in question. A few dozen people showed up, drawn by the story of the dog's steadfast devotion. They held candles, offered silent prayers, and placed flowers around the grave. Scrap remained unmoving, only raising his head occasionally to observe the crowd with wary eyes. It was at the vigil that a stranger arrived, a middle-aged woman with tear-stained cheeks. She introduced herself as Lena, her voice quivering as she spoke. She claimed that the unidentified man could very well be her younger brother Jacob, who'd been estranged from the family for nearly a decade. She'd lost contact with him after a bitter fight. He'd chosen a life of wandering, drifting from town to town with his dog, Oscar. Lena had never met Oscar, but had heard from mutual acquaintances that Jacob had rescued a stray while living on the streets, refusing to abandon him even when it meant going hungry. The last she'd heard, he was passing through the area months ago. Then silence. No calls, no letters, nothing. She had assumed he'd moved on. When she saw Mari's footage of Scrap at the grave, Lena felt a pang of recognition. Jacob's devotion to his dog had been legendary among their acquaintances. Could Scrap be Oscar, still waiting for his master? The moment Lena laid eyes on the dog, she burst into tears. Scrap, Oscar, did not move from the grave, but his ears perked, and he let out a low, confused whine, as though something in Lena's presence stirred a buried memory. Lena approached tentatively, calling out, "Oscar." In a trembling whisper, the dog's tail thumped once, uncertain. Then, after a long pause, it lowered its head again, pressing its muzzle to the cold earth. Lena's sobs grew louder. She begged the dog to come home with her, to let her right the wrongs, to make amends for the years she'd lost with her brother. But Oscar, Scrap, would not move. In the days that followed, Lena jumped through bureaucratic hoops to have a DNA test performed on the remains in the grave, determined to confirm or refute her suspicion that it was her brother. The excruciating weight weighed on everyone. Meanwhile, the dog's condition grew dire. The brutal winter winds took a toll. Despite efforts to keep him fed and warm, his once scruffy coat began falling out in clumps. His limbs shook from the cold. Concerned townspeople grew frantic. Surely, the best thing would be to take him to a shelter or a vet. But each time someone tried, the dog fought desperately, trembling as though the very act of moving him would break an unspoken promise, and devised a plan to build an enclosed pen around the grave, just large enough to protect Scrap from the wind and let him remain where he was. They worked around the clock, erecting wooden walls lined with insulation. This time the dog didn't resist. It stood quietly to the side, warily eyeing the construction until the structure was finished. Then, with a shiver, it stepped inside, returning once more to the headstone as if its entire world existed in that small circle of space. Days melted into one another, and the DNA test results were delayed by holiday backlogs. Lena visited the cemetery daily, telling stories about her brother in a shaky voice, how he used to nurse injured birds back to health when they were kids, how he once jumped into a frozen pond to save a drowning puppy, how he believed in kindness above all else. Each tale seemed to lull the dog into a deeper stillness, as though listening. Lena would occasionally end her visits in tears, pressing her hand against the casket's cold marker, apologizing for the long years of absence. Would watch from a distance, his heart heavy. Finally, the call came. The remains were indeed Jacob's. Lena collapsed against when she heard the news, sobbing with relief and guilt and sorrow. She had found her brother at last, but he was gone. The next step was to arrange a proper service, give him a name on that gravestone instead of leaving him a John Doe. Maybe, she hoped, that would free the dog to come home with her. The caretaker agreed to help. Mari promised a small memorial, ensuring the world would know Jacob's story, an unknown hero saved by his dog, or perhaps the dog was saved by him. They'd shared everything, down to their final breaths. The day of the official memorial service dawned bright and cold. A brittle wind cut through the cemetery as guests gathered, forming a small but solemn circle around Jacob's grave. Lena clutched a photograph of her brother, taken years ago when he was still wide-eyed and hopeful, and stood close, offering support, hovered at a respectful distance. Mari's camera captured the scene, broadcasting it to the numerous followers who had come to care about Scrap's story. The newly erected headstone now bore Jacob's name, along with a simple inscription: "He loved and was loved. May he rest in peace." Throughout the service, Scrap lay at the base of the headstone, unmoving even as people crowded around, leaving flowers and small tokens. As the final prayer was spoken, Lena knelt beside the dog, tears dripping onto the cold ground. Quietly she said, "Oscar, please, he's at peace now. Let me take care of you." Her voice trembled with urgency and hope. The dog slowly lifted his muzzle. Their eyes met. A flicker of recognition, a gentle spark, passed between them. For the first time, the dog shifted closer to her, pressing its nose against her trembling hand. Lena sucked in a breath, half laughing, half sobbing. She stroked the dog's ears with trembling fingers, whispering promises and apologies. It was a breathtaking moment, one that felt as if the threads of the universe were sewing themselves back together in front of everyone's eyes. But just when it seemed as though Scrap Oscar might finally leave the grave, the dog let out a soft whimper and turned back to the headstone. His posture was conflicted, caught between a living memory and a restless spirit. Sighing deeply, Lena continued to stroke his fur. The memorial concluded, people began to drift away, offering hushed condolences and tearful goodbyes. Yet the dog remained. Lena didn't force him, understanding at last that this might take time. Love can't be rushed, not when it's carried such a painful burden for so long. Over the next few days, a new pattern emerged. Lena would spend hours sitting by the dog, reading old journal entries she'd found among Jacob's few possessions. She shared details of their childhood, flipping through worn photo albums, tears occasionally spotting the pages. Gradually, the dog began to scoot closer, resting his head on her knee when she read. She'd scratch behind his ears, a small smile illuminating her face. It was a fragile, tentative bond they were forming, each uncertain how to grieve the same man, but both wanting to find solace in one another. At night, Lena would reluctantly leave, promising to return in the morning. The dog would watch her go, then curl up by the headstone once more. A week after the memorial, a sudden snow storm battered the town. Fierce winds howled, snowdrifts piled high, and power lines snapped under the weight of ice. The temperature plummeted dangerously. Worried that, despite the shelter around the grave, the dog might not survive. Determined, Lena and Mari braved the storm together, inching through the knee-deep snow to reach the cemetery. They found the pen partially collapsed under the weight of the snow, with the dog huddled inside, shivering uncontrollably. In desperation, they wrapped him in thick blankets and carried him into the caretaker's office, down a narrow flight of stairs into a small storage area heated by a single radiator. The dog weakly struggled at first, whining but gave in, exhausted. For hours they stayed with him, feeding him warm broth, rubbing his cold fur to stimulate circulation. The howling storm outside shook the tiny windows, and occasionally the lights flickered ominously. Lena whispered soothing words, singing lullabies she recalled from childhood memories of Jacob, telling the dog that it was okay, that Jacob would want him to live. Each time she said Jacob's name, the dog's ears would perk slightly, as if caught between memory and heartbreak. Bit by bit, warmth returned to his body. He slowly sank into a fitful sleep, eyes darting behind closed lids. Perhaps he dreamed of the roads he had walked with Jacob, or the nights they spent comforting one another, always together, surviving on scraps and hope. By the next morning, the storm had subsided, leaving a world blanketed in pristine white silence. Lena and Mari ventured outside to assess the damage. The cemetery looked surreal, mounds of snow obscuring the usual paths, branches snapped under the weight of ice. Where the grave stood, drifts were piled high against the fallen walls of the shelter. They spent hours clearing the area, eventually exposing Jacob's headstone again. The dog stood nearby, tail low, anxiously watching. Lena knelt at the grave, pressing a hand against the stone. "He's free," she murmured, "and I think he'd want you to be free too." Over the next few days, the dog lingered around the caretaker's building for warmth, occasionally drifting back to the headstone. But each visit was a little shorter than before. Lena brought him a collar and gently placed it around his neck, whispering, "You'll always have a place with me. Always." The dog accepted it with minimal resistance, as though understanding that this new bond was an extension of the old one it had lost. And then, one gray afternoon, something profound happened. The sky threatened another snowfall, and the cemetery lay silent except for the crunch of Lena's boots on the path. She made her usual trek to the grave with the dog at her side. Upon reaching it, she placed a single rose on the headstone. The dog leaned forward, sniffing the flower. Then, in a gesture so subtle it could have been missed, the dog looked at Lena, looked at the grave, and slowly backed away. It was the first time he had chosen to step away without being forced. With an air of solemn finality, he turned his gaze to Lena, tail wagging ever so slightly. Tears welled in her eyes as she recognized the moment for what it was, a goodbye and a promise to move forward. She gave a small nod. Together they walked out of the cemetery, crossing the threshold hand in paw, leaving behind the heartbreak that had bound them. In the weeks that followed, the dog, Oscar, as Lena now firmly called him, settled into her home. It wasn't an easy transition. He often whimpered at night, turning in circles, as if searching for a warm body no longer there. On rainy afternoons, he'd lie by the window, ears flattened, eyes distant. But Lena remained patient, showering him with quiet love, gentle reassurance, and a warm bed. Over time, the weight he'd carried began to lift. He grew more playful, even wagging his tail with genuine enthusiasm when Lena came home from work. Bit by bit they healed. Mari wrote a heartfelt piece about Scrap Oscar's story, weaving together every shred of detail she'd unearthed: the unknown man, the heroic dog, the sister's desperate search for closure. She posted it online. Within days, it went viral, as thousands of people around the world responded to the raw emotion and devotion captured in the tale. Comments flooded in, people sharing stories of their own pets, loyalty, or reaching out to mend broken relationships in their lives. The story touched a universal chord. Love does not die just because life ends. Sometimes it lingers at a graveside, faithful until it can find a path forward. Yet the story didn't stop there. Days after the piece went viral, Lena received a message from a man claiming to be Jacob's old friend from high school, someone who'd lost touch with him long ago, but never stopped wondering what happened. He thanked Lena for giving Jacob a proper resting place and for caring for the dog he'd loved. He visited the town soon after, offering to help place a new plaque at the grave, one that included a small engraved image of a dog at the bottom, symbolizing a bond that reached beyond the grave itself. In the spring, as the thaw set in and the cemetery returned to life, the caretaker cleared away the broken wooden pen around Jacob's grave. Grass began to sprout and wildflowers popped up, gently swaying in the mild breeze. Sometimes saw Lena and Oscar sitting quietly by the headstone, perhaps talking to Jacob, perhaps just basking in the memory. Each time, he felt a warm ache in his chest, recalling how he'd once been terrified that the dog would die on that very spot. Instead, the dog had honored his friend until a new bond gave him the strength to leave, carrying Jacob's love forward in a gentle wag of the tail. The final footnote to this story arrived in the form of a letter, sent anonymously to Lena's home address. Inside was a photograph of a man holding a puppy with a wide grin, standing near a battered trailer. Scribbled on the back were the words, "He never forgot you." The photograph could only have been Jacob. Lena's chest tightened at the sight of it. Though she had no idea who sent it or how they found her, it felt like a gentle whisper from Jacob himself, a reminder that love had always been the thread binding them, even when life pulled them apart. Lena took the photo to the cemetery. Oscar, Scrap, followed her faithfully. They stood by Jacob's grave as she placed the photograph there, propped against the newly inscribed headstone. Tears filled her eyes, but there was a fragile smile on her lips. She knelt down, arms around the dog, and murmured, "You kept him company when I couldn't. Thank you." Oscar placed a soft paw on her arm, meeting her gaze with his soulful brown eyes. In that silent exchange, everything Jacob had been, and everything he meant, blossomed into a profound peace between them. These days, if you visit that old cemetery, you'll find an unremarkable gravestone set among dozens of others. And yet, if you pay attention, You might notice a single rose placed at its base every now and then, or a small bundle of wildflowers. You might even glimpse a scruffy dog and a kind woman sitting nearby in thoughtful silence. The dog no longer lies on the grave day and night, but he visits with unwavering loyalty to pay homage to a memory that shaped his life. Whenever people hear the story, and many still do, as it circulates around the internet and in hushed whispers, they are struck by the dog's refusal to leave, by the heartbreak of the reason, and by the hope that emerged from that sorrow. In the end, love is not a chain. It's a connection that outlives the boundaries of life and death. And sometimes, that love takes the shape of a scruffy dog lying at a grave, refusing to move until the world recognizes that devotion can transcend even the darkest of tragedies. That small bundle of fur with gentle eyes taught an entire town that loyalty and heartbreak, when intertwined, can inspire profound compassion. And perhaps that's why so many still share the story to this day. In a world that can feel so cold and indifferent, a single dog refused to leave the side of the friend he loved, reminding us all that some bonds simply cannot be broken.